Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. We're all here today because we're living in this world that is profoundly shaping our kids in ways that may inspire a variety of reaction in us as adults. I'm especially appreciative to be here as an educator, a former classroom teacher, and a current New York City Department of Education parent. I'm also grateful to be here on behalf of Common Sense Media. We're a nonprofit where helping kids and families thrive in our ever-evolving digital world has been our mission for almost 20 years. And as we all know, media and tech have evolved dramatically over that time. It's a world that's constantly new and changing with so many great opportunities for learning, but one that also comes with real significant challenges. One of these challenges is the 24/7 bombardment of content and information, which leads us to what we find ourselves in now, which is this age of distraction. As part of Common Sense Media, Common Sense Education has been partnering with the New York City Department of Education for over a decade, offering free curriculum and resources that help educators and families guide their kids through the digital world in safe, healthy, and empowering ways. We've also partnered on creating the DOE's social media guidelines and DigCit responsibilities. At Common Sense, we see digital citizenship as an essential life skill. So what does that mean? It's really where students are learning about media balance to minimize distractions, also how to leverage technology to create, to connect, all the great things, and then of course, navigating areas like your digital footprint and privacy, and thinking about misinformation, and then dealing with digital drama and cyberbullying. We hear really often from teachers that fights that start online make their way into the classroom. And we also know that what kids are hearing and seeing online, whether it's hate speech or responding to a friend who's really in need, can have a profound effect on their mental health and well-being. So learning how to manage all of that is really what digital citizenship is all about. So with that, I'm very excited for this evening's discussion. This is a two-parter, so I hope you'll stay with us. First, we're going to talk with New York City Department of Education Chancellor David Banks, a lifelong New Yorker, learner, and educator, including founding the Eagle Academy for Young Men. He became chancellor this year, leading the largest school district in the nation. And then afterwards, we're going to talk with Dr. Sherry Turkle, professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT and author of several books that really explore how technology impacts our capacities for empathy and reflection. So we hope you'll stay with us throughout. We're also going to have time for Q&A, so please think about your questions. And now it's my absolute pleasure to begin with Chancellor Banks on how to best help our students. Great. I wanted to start by talking to you about technology equity. And at Common Sense Media, we've really been thinking about digital equity for over a decade now, and thinking about it in terms of both access to high-speed internet, reliable devices, and also, of course, to digital skills training, to digital citizenship resources for educators, for students, for families. And so my question for you is really about the new federal funding that came through to provide schools with a lot of infrastructure. How are you thinking about using this, and what are you thinking about in terms of the deployment and implementation in terms of really trying to address the digital divide?
Yeah, no, so thank you so much, first of all, for having me. I appreciate being here, and thank everybody for even being out, and hope everyone is getting around and enjoying this tremendous exhibit. I think the pandemic really exposed a lot of inequity in the nation, and certainly the digital divide was one of them. From the basic rudiments of having just the tablets that you need at home, and we've said to everybody they have to work from home and go to school virtually, and if you didn't have the tablets that are necessary to do that, that was certainly a real issue of inequity, number one. But number two, I think just the ability to navigate the tools that are necessary, the training for the teachers and those who we count on to help support our students. Not just from playing games, because the kids have mastered that. They know how to access the tools and make their way using the tools, using the technology. But the level of technology that's needed in order to ensure a high level of quality educational experience is what we're really concerned about. And so we've been leaning in and developing a plan, I think, to move forward. And it's also going to involve engaging with partners, like Common Sense Media. What you've been doing in this space is really, really important. And so engaging with the right kinds of partners who also understand how the technology really needs to be used as a tool is really, really important. But it's not just that. It is, what I think a lot about is the kinds of experiences that kids really need to have, which go beyond the basic notion of technology. Here's what I mean as an example. If you're a sixth grader at a middle school in Harlem, and you don't happen to have a great math teacher, you just drew the short straw, and now you're struggling in math. Why should any child be limited to simply the experience of their teacher who's in their classroom? That using technology, we should be able to close some of those gaps. They can have exposure to a phenomenal math teacher on the other side of town, on the other side of the city, on the other side of the state. I dare say on the other side of the world. When technology is used the right way, we should be able to expand opportunity, expand these issues and notions of equity, and really close many of the gaps that our children have engaged in. And the reason for that is because we've not been creative and innovative enough. Too many of our schools, even when we think of technology, we think of the very basics of technology. I think about when billionaires fly into outer space, how do we create young people to have opportunities to speak to those who created those rocket ships? What was that experience while they were in outer space, having those conversations? Just a level of exposure that opens up the power of possibility. Mm-hmm. When technology is used the right way, it can be a tremendous tool, but I'm also very concerned about how it goes beyond being a tool and becoming something, having an even greater influence on the lives of our kids than it really should.
Well, I'm thinking about a few different things that you brought up. So I'm thinking about that sixth grade student having access, whether it's to other learning opportunities, other people, and then also that teacher potentially having more opportunities around professional development to help,
right. It's a great point.
Help them improve. But I think, too, what you were highlighting as well is how do we think about kind of the role in terms of what technology can offer us, those possibilities, but then also about that face-to-face human connection too. Coming off of the pandemic when so many of our kids were fully virtual, and it may have worked for some, but for others it was really a challenge. How do you think about kind of navigating, when are we using technology, when are we not using technology? And I think about that a lot because at Common Sense, that's what we talk about, is exactly what you're saying. How do we use technology for all those opportunities, to access the great resources, but then when do we know to kind of, close and focus? Or right now, this is a time for us to have sustained eye contact.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. There's always going to be a balancing of these kind of two worlds almost, if you will. The question is, finding the right balance. I'm of the mindset that we are human beings and we're not robots. We are beings, and there's something about the very notion of being present in the moment, being connected to something other than a device, the eye-to-eye contact, the human touch, the hug, the pat on the back. All of those are things that are elements of our human beingness, if you will. And that I don't think there is a technological substitute for. That when you blend and balance that human beingness with the appropriate tools that can stretch our imagination, it's that combination that I think can elevate our experiences. But it's more than a notion. It will take work, because it is very easy to lean into a place and space where we don't need human beings. We can find at some level of technology a robot to give you a hug if that's what you want, or to shake your hand, or to give you the pat on the back. So I'm always concerned about a world in which we believe that we are not even necessary, or that we can be completely substituted for. That is a world that I'm very fearful of, and I think we've got to work really hard to keep technology in its place as a proper tool, and that we don't allow it to reach a point where it takes our place. And that will be the push and the pull that we will have to decide and fight and struggle with each other as a people of human beings.
Well, I'm really excited about the mayor's recent announcement about the new Career Pathways program.
Sure.
And so I was thinking about that in terms of, I'm hoping you can say a little bit more about that and how that connects with giving our students the opportunity to be part of this bigger conversation about what role do we want technology to play in our lives? How do we want it to suit us best? You know, when you were talking about the billionaires going into space, sometimes I'm like, hey, billionaires, could you spend your money on something else? And so I'm hopeful for our students to really be ethical creators and thinking about the impacts. And so can you share a little bit about what the DOE is working on in that new program?
First of all, it's interesting because the billionaire's response would be, yeah, we do spend our money on other things as well, but this is something that we also want to do. We are thinking well beyond planet Earth. And if the research is correct, right, we exist on a planet which is supported by a star that has a limited lifespan. And so it won't happen in our lifetime per se, but we ought to be thinking about what is beyond even this place that we're in. And so I certainly don't fault them for that. But I will tell you that I think about young people taking their rightful place in the creating, developing of a new world for themselves and for those who are coming behind them. And so what does that mean? That means that school ought to be much more purposeful than I think it often is. I like to say that we've done a good job of schooling. Right? Schooling meaning young people go through the routine of going to school every day. They do their lessons. Much of it is compliance work. Mm-hmm. They're just following the direction of the teacher of a particular assignment. They have no clue about what this should ultimately connect them to. And so for me, the purpose of school is really about creating career pathways, putting young people on a path to economic security, and then having the tools for social change. They ought to be studying in school the issues of global climate change. That shouldn't be put on the sideline because we've got to do schoolwork while the real world issues are absent in the lives of their educational experiences. So the Career Pathways announcement that we made a couple of days ago at J.P. Morgan Chase, together with the mayor and other business leaders, was to say, we've got to create real apprenticeships for young people, even while they're in our public schools, so that they understand what the light at the end of the tunnel really looks like. You know, it's hard to dream of becoming an investment banker if you've never met one. It's hard to understand what it means to be a NASA scientist or to work at a place like Google or Microsoft if you've had no exposure. Some students have had exposure. vast majority of students have no clue what any of those careers even look like. And so what is the purpose of school? Why do we have them from the time they're 3 and 4 and 5 years old, and we take them all the way through high school? They're not civically engaged. They're not taking their place in this democratic republic that we have. They don't understand how it works. They don't know how money is made and this economy works. They don't know the world of business. But yet we give them a diploma and we give them a pat on the back and we congratulate them. But they don't know how to do a lot of stuff. We can do better. And the idea of the career pathways is to say, let's start that talk about real stuff. I think kids can have an exciting experience in school every day. They can learn math and science and English and history and everything else while they are studying the issues of what's going on right now. We had a scare in one of the public housing projects recently where they thought there was arsenic in the water. It was a gentleman who just won the New York State Teacher of the Year award. And I was fascinated by him as he said, as he studied that, he didn't say just what a shame. He had the students all bringing in samples of water from their own homes, and they were going to study it. They were going to do in their chemistry classes, making this like real stuff in the context of current events and what was happening. That's the kind of thing that excites kids because it connects to something that's real and meaningful. If we were doing that every day in all of our classes across not only New York City, but across America, kids would have a deeper appreciation for their educational experience and why they're in class every day. And I think that would ultimately make a huge difference. And I think when you connect it to technology, again, the technology merely being a tool, but technology has I think, a place in everything that we do. It just ought not be everything that we do.
Yeah, well said. Well, I think I want to go further with that in terms of, so Common Sense had a research report that was issued where basically young people are using screens over 20% more now, since the pandemic started. I'm sure that surprises nobody here. Sure. And we try to focus more on quality and talking about how not all screen time is equal versus, all screen time is the same and how much time are you spending on it. And so I guess following up on that, thinking about how we're using technology, how do you think about students being conscious consumers, being conscious creators, and making it worthwhile screen time and not kind of the throwaway stuff?
It's a good question. When left on their own, many of them are just playing the games and having fun. I've seen so many young people who are now involved in these virtual games that they get to play with their friends. And everybody's in a different place, but they're actually all together. It has some benefit, I believe, but it's going to take an education kind of marketing strategy to start for parents, for educators, so that our kids understand what's the real purpose of life. What are we ultimately trying to achieve? We don't want to take away their fun and the things that they enjoy doing, but we've got to figure out some better strategies. I don't have all the answers. I'll be the first to admit it. I came from an era where playing Atari was a big deal. And I don't even pretend to try to keep up with some of the games that the kids are playing now. They blow my mind. I'm always taken aback by some of what I see, a lot of negativity, the violence in some of the games that they're playing. But beyond the gaming itself, I'm a big believer in the great outdoors. I'm a big believer in our bodies being in motion, that we were not, as human beings, designed to just stare at phones all day. But we're up against a tough adversary now, Tali, because kids, not just kids, it's so much of our human population are just completely locked in on the phone. It's become our new reality, and we're going to have to figure out some new and innovative ways to kind of keep it in its proper context.
Well, I think that's what excites me so much about our partnership is I think that schools are really uniquely positioned to provide students with different strategies and their families too. And I appreciate what you're touching on as well as I think it's really that reflection. So we talk a lot about how do we build in reflection so that kids, and I'm gonna say this as a parent, and adults really take a step back and say, okay, what's working for me? Like, does it make me feel good that when my kids come home from school, they're telling me about their day, and I hear a text and I immediately look at it? It doesn't make me feel good because it's breaking that connection. But going back to moving your bodies, I love that too. But could I also model, using an app to help me exercise more or to ding and remind me to stand up instead of sitting down so much? And so I think there's all those opportunities at schools right now for teachers to be talking about that. Having opportunities where they say, all right, we're gonna have some device-free time right now because the purpose of this is to focus really on X, Y, and Z. But now I want you to go out and look for something else. Use your phone or use your Chromebook that was, your school-issued device.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And I think what you just laid out is a perfect example, right? You can use your app for a great exercise program, but you're going to do the exercise. You're not going to let the technology just do the exercising for you.
That's right. And if it's something that doesn't motivate you, don't do it. I mean, we have what we call a thinking routine, and there's one that's called Digital Habits Checkup, and I'm going to invite all of you to do this. I've done this with my family and friends. It's just take a moment to think about all of your digital habits and just think about which ones, just list them all out, and then afterwards think about which ones you think of as positive and which ones you think of negative. And then just choose one that maybe you identify as a negative one. It could be doom scrolling right before bed, for example. Right. And then think about, okay, what can I do instead of that? So my strategy might be I leave my phone in the other room and I have a book because I know my habit is just picking it up immediately. So that's my invitation to everyone. And that's something that we encourage educators to also do with students that I think.
Agree. That's great. And that's why we need to partner with groups like Common Sense, because what oftentimes we engage in is not common sense. Common sense is not always so common, right? And so we've got to make sure we're giving real practical strategies to families, because what I have witnessed is that parents are finding it increasingly difficult to, there used to be a time when they would just say, put the phone down, and that was the end of it. That's not the end of it anymore. Right. These kids are very persistent, and they test every bit of patience that you have as a parent, as an adult, as a teacher. And oftentimes we give up, right? Yeah. And we just concede, go and do whatever you want to do, and which is exactly what kids want. And so I think part of the message has to be, don't concede. We've got to do some things because it's in their best interest. They shouldn't be able to just stay up all night long in this virtual world until their body just physically gives out. And as soon as they wake up in the morning, the first thing they do is reach for their device. I think those are unhealthy habits, and we've got to help parents. We've got to get the parents to be able to be on the side of really helping the kids in a better way.
So I have a question for you about that, because I think a lot about, so as a former teacher and also, working in Common Sense, I feel like I'm at schools a lot, and there's a lot of like, the parents need to do this, the parents need to do that. And then I talk to parents, and they're like, the schools need to be teaching this, the schools need to be teaching that. And then, of course, a little bit of like big tech needs to make it, because honestly, it's really hard and complicated to stop doing a lot of these things and find the right controls. I guess my question for you on that is, it seems like everyone's ready to pass the buck, and it's a huge problem, and honestly, we all have to be working together on it, including the tech companies. How do you foster kind of a feeling of shared responsibility?
Yeah, I think that's a message that comes from a position that I'm in as chancellor of the largest school system in the nation. That if we're able to create the right kind of campaign around that, people do pay attention. Yeah. And it does influence how adults show up, parents as well as our educators. And what I've come to find since I've been in this position is that people around the nation also watch what we say and do here in New York. There have been remarks that I've just made that I didn't even think were a big deal, and they get picked up all across the country. So you realize that we have a very powerful platform here. There are people who are paying attention to this conversation right now and thinking about how they may move differently in other parts of the nation as well. So it's a huge responsibility. I'm continuing to try to learn more myself on a daily basis and fashion the right type of message that can be shared and hopefully amplified across the system.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate that you highlighted, the incredible power of your role. And I'm curious your thoughts around, various school districts and state DOEs are now banning smartphones or all phones. And I know the New York City Department of Education does not ban phones. And I guess if a superintendent came to you and said, what's your advice, Chancellor? What should we do? What would you advise on whether or not they should ban phones?
Oh, certainly I wouldn't be in support of banning phones. I think initially when phones first came out, that was happening even across the city because it was new and people saw it as a danger and they weren't sure how to deal with it. But I think we've come a long way, at least in New York, since then. I'm not in favor of the banning of a lot of things, the whole notion of banning things. I think schools are places where you work it out.
Yeah.
Schools are places where, I'm not big into banning books and banning this and banning that. Let's take these issues head on. Let's come up with new and creative ideas. And the best way to do that is not what the chancellor says. It's what do the people say? What are the parents saying? What are the educators saying? What are the students saying? Yeah. The students themselves will come up with some of the best ideas of how we should incorporate not only phones, but all of technology across the classrooms that they are in. What I've come to realize is that when you fully engage the students, they will give you the path forward. They will give you the best answers. They will give you those, what I refer to as the aha moments, the things that I would have never thought of. But because they're living it every day and they're engaged in it, they have a sense of what's good about it, as well as what are some of the negative things about it as well. And they will help to fashion a way forward. So the more young people that we talk to, the better off we will be. And to me, that's what their educational experience should be about as well. We can't just say we want young people to be leaders, but yet we never put them in the game.
Right.
They're like, put me in the game, coach.
Right.
You're looking to solve, they'll help us solve most of the issues if we would simply ask and then listen. And I think that's incumbent upon us to do that.
Yeah, and I think, again, there's such a great opportunity. I mean, you brought up before, civic engagement, and we're, living in this time of so much cynicism, but at the same time, we know that young people are deeply engaged and excited, but I think we need to provide that space and those models for what does it look like to have civil discourse.
I want to see student government in every school across New York City. I want to see these young people debating the issues of the day. I want them getting outside of the four walls of the school and engaging in real civic participation. Not just a civics class, but real civic engagement where they understand, they show up at a congressman's town hall meeting, the community planning board. Most people would say, what's that? If I ask most people in this room right now, could you, before you left here, tell me the difference between the Attorney General, the District Attorney, and the U.S. Attorney? They're all three very different roles. And if I said, you've got to write out the distinction between them before you are allowed to leave, many of you be here all night long, right? And yet we send our kids to these public schools, and there are basic things that they don't know. Remember when Jay Leno was the head of the Tonight Show? How many of you remember that? I mean, I might be telling my age here a little bit. And he would have that thing, the walk down Hollywood Boulevard, and jaywalking, and he would just stop people, indiscriminately, and just ask them basic questions about American history, and they got some of the most ridiculous answers, and we got a good laugh out of it. The part of it that's not funny is that these are all U.S. high school graduates who don't know a damn thing, and so when we think about why our citizenry is just not engaged, I believe deeply, it's because we've not developed that muscle in the K-12 space. You see, if we were engaging kids in things that really matter in K-12, and they can see how those things really impact their lives, you would see young people graduating from high school and taking a strong step. They couldn't wait until they had a chance to vote. They've been practicing it all of these years, and now they get to do it for real. But we don't do that, and those are some of the things I'm trying to change.
And I think that's the exciting part, too, with technology, where it complicates it, where now we've got to think about the role of misinformation in a whole different way in algorithms, but we also get to engage with the technology as well while we're talking to kids about it. So I think it's both an engagement and a tool we have to educate about, too.
That's right.
I'm sorry, I got the note. We are ready for, do we have time for questions? Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. I see a bold hand raised. I think they're going to come around with a mic.
Chancellor, thank you.
Thank you.
I am a parent, and I would really like to see action. What I mean by this is, I let my daughter, she's 15, have a device. But I have a plan in the house, which is a constant discussion of device responsibility. We talk about boredom. We try to get to the roots of what boredom is. What is this device satisfying in me or in her? And I feel like if a school is not going to oust devices, then it's the responsibility of the school, obligatory class or some kind of workshop where you're teaching device responsibility. And it shouldn't be a free-for-all of just people going and using their devices. There has to be, I always say, if you move 2 units in the direction of technology, we have to move 3 units in our humanity. Because if not, tech will overtake what it means to be human. And I think that tech is such an important, what's happening with tech is so important right now because it's really such an unbelievable reflection of ourselves, so much so that it's almost augmenting what we look like. It's a caricature of all of our own virtualities. And to be able to use the device as a tool in school to reflect on those things about what it means to be human, I don't see a greater gift that you could give a student coming out to and prepared for the world, a little sense of who they are. So I just wonder what you think about, if you leave schools, the ability to use devices there. Where's the responsibility, and is that something that you're trying to tackle?
I love the question. And we have a couple of our superintendents who are here today who joined us as well. And appreciate you both for being here. Your question is a wonderful opening salvo in a grand debate that could be developed at schools all across the city. Easiest thing in the world for me to do is to say, I take the position that you just took, and I'm now going to implement policies and procedures to support that. And there will be no problem in me doing it, be some pushback, certainly across the city, but I have the authority to do that. I'm working with our superintendents to make something like that happen. The point I think I was trying to make was to say, there are young people, there are educators, there are parents who might be diametrically opposed to everything that you just said and have a very different opinion with their own set of rationales around technology, even almost a free-for-all, being one of the best things that's ever happened to us. The last thing you want to do is limit its use. In limiting its use, you're limiting a level of creativity that young people could ultimately aspire to. And we respect the opinion of the opening comment that was made, but let me offer up the other side. That's what I would like to see. I would like to see the school community. I don't want to create a one-size-fits-all. The system is just too large. I would love to see schools engage in this kind of conversation to determine what's the best fit for their school community. When you do it as a one-size-fits-all, I think you just have resistance, and you wind up having fights that are needless. I think it's better when you get a chance to flush it out as a school community. And then you have that conversation and ultimately try to find a consensus points that everybody can live with. But I do think it is our responsibility to at least invoke the conversation to be had. And that is a huge takeaway for me.
And I think really what you're talking about is digital citizenship. It's cultivating in our students the skills and the dispositions to know how to use their technology responsibly, so that when they're out in the real world, when they're out, in their careers and beyond, they know when to put away their phones. They know how to use it for learning. They know how to keep their humanity, but also get all of the great things. And we have to practice that in school. And I think we also have to allow the space for them to make mistakes, and then those are learning opportunities where we discuss them and analyze them, to your point.
And again, and I totally agree. I actually, the position that you just took is a position I actually agree with. What I've come to realize is that there are others who would agree with me, but that doesn't make me right. There are people who take very different positions as well, and I've come to have a greater degree of respect and appreciation for that. Who gets to define what digital citizenship actually means? There are schools right now who are saying, school systems across the nation, who are saying, we believe in digital citizenship. And for us, what that means, we're taking your phones from you when you get to school. They're not allowed in school. That's how they have defined digital citizenship, as one of the attributes. Other schools would say, absolutely not. We're not taking them away, but we're going to create some limits around its use. Another district comes up with a different definition. All I'm saying is we
get common sense when we say digital citizenship. It's really about providing kids the skills to think critically, behave safely, participate responsibly in the digital world.
Yes.
Yeah, and struggle with all the real nuances that are there.
Absolutely.
Do we have time for, okay, we do not have time for another question.
I'm so sorry that I've got to run.
No, we know. Chancellor, I really want to thank you so much for joining us tonight and engaging in this conversation.
This was a real pleasure for me to be here, and thank you to everybody for being here as well. Thank you.
I'm now excited to talk with Professor Sherry Turkle. We're going to further explore the impact of technology on young people's relationships and sense of belonging. And I just want to highlight for a moment, Dr. Turkle, you're the only one who's not in person with us tonight. But that's okay. We're delighted to have Zoom here, and I think that really speaks to the conversation we're having too. So thank you so much for joining.
It's really my pleasure.
So I just want to start, Dr. Turkle, talking about how your feelings towards media and technology have shifted quite a bit over your career. Can you talk about those shifts and what were the moments that caused this change?
Yes, I began my career by being the darling of Wired magazine. I was on the cover of Wired magazine. I think I was the first woman on the cover of Wired magazine, because what I saw in particular the early life on the, I called it life on the screen, was the extraordinary possibilities of people exploring identity in digital space. You could go online, and people who were introverts could be more extroverted. People could experiment with gender. People could, I called it an identity workshop. And I found that really thrilling. And I was very mad at my fellow psychologists who were very, oh, it's a computer. Ooh, I'm not really a computer person. I was very cross with them. And I said, no, this is a new evocative object. This is a psychological machine. This is something that's really changing the way people think about their mind. It's an intimate machine. And so I don't want to say I was a booster, because that would be a little much, but I was very excited by the identity aspects of what the digital culture was bringing, especially to children and adolescents. But then I guess you would call this my Wired magazine cover girl phase. But then I began to see the downside, and maybe this is the only downside I need to talk about, because it kind of is the turning point that will bring us up to the present. With mobile phones, in this original phase where I was very, I don't want to say pro, but where I was very excited, you had your life. Let me not call it real life, because I don't want to say that what you do on the computer isn't real. But you had your daily life, and then you said, I think I want to do some of this identity play on the computer. You walked over to your computer, you sat down, and you did what I called this identity workshop, this identity play, in the computer community, in the digital community, of the game, of the simulation space, where you had created an avatar, or where you were talking to people all over the world, however you were doing it. In other words, there was a distinction between your life and when you sat down and you did this identity work. When everything started to happen on your phone, carried with you all the time, what I found in my research is what everyone found in their research, is that the boundaries between your life on the screen and your life disappeared. And the screen became more and more seductive, and young people, and particularly adolescents, were drawn more and more to living more and more of their lives in digital space. And this was an entirely different psychological dynamic, because what I found was that a new state of the self was being created, which I called I share, therefore I am. People didn't feel as though they were whole, as though they were themselves, unless they had shared on the screen. And, the importance of solitude, and maybe this is where I'll stop so we can have a more of an interchange, but the importance of solitude, of being able to put your devices down, to cultivate a sense of self within yourself, is essential to having real interpersonal relationships, because only when you feel that sense of wholeness can you come to another person and appreciate them as another, not as someone who's going to be there to sort of fill in what you need. You need to be seen, you need to be sharing, you're not whole unless you're sharing and having that self filled in. You can't stand to be alone. And I was seeing more and more that people were developing an intolerance for solitude, and you couldn't be bored. You had to be constantly stimulated, constantly reinforced, and with that, a capacity for empathy declined, a capacity for relationship declined, and I felt we were kind of at a kind of break the glass moment, because we weren't addressing the downside of what our screens were doing to us. And this was before Facebook and the scraping of data, and before all of this. So that was kind of the turning point for me when I began to see the downside of this life of continual sharing and the assault on empathy that it brought. Long answer to a short question.
No, it's I appreciate how you're highlighting the focus on solitude, and I just want to check with you if we take a developmental standpoint, because I feel like it can feel a little bit counterintuitive that in order for me to really understand and be okay with others and truly empathetic, I have to understand and be okay and know myself. And I think from a developmental stage, that's a key piece. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And so it's a little bit counterintuitive, but if you think about it. So let me just kind of lay it out maybe again. There's a wonderful quote, kind of a paraphrase of a psychoanalytic thinker that says, if you don't want your children to be lonely, make sure they know how to be alone. In other words, the capacity for solitude, to know who you, I don't want to get too misty about this, it's never perfect, but that sense that you have a sense of boundaries, you're okay, you've been taught how to take a beach walk and look around you and feel, yeah, I'm here in nature and I'm okay with that. I'm not reaching to be distracted. Means that you can come to another person and you're not looking to be immediately made you're not looking to be told who you are. You're looking to turn to another person and say, who are you? Who are you? Tell me who you are. Let me put myself in your place, which you can't do if you are not okay with yourself. So teaching children to be alone, and you teach children to be alone by being alone with them, taking a walk on the beach, taking a walk in a city, just holding their hand and being quiet, walking in nature. But it doesn't have to be in nature. It can just be reading silently next to them, and sharing quiet time, sitting in front of a fire with them, just sitting quietly next to a child and teaching a child that it's okay just to be with themselves, and because you're comfortable being with yourself. That's how children learn that going into themselves is something that they should learn to do because you value it. And you're not always looking at your phone. So I was very impressed by your last session, which I watched with great attention, on the focus you put on what parents are modeling and what teachers are modeling. Because when I go into classrooms and I see a teacher go into class and the first thing they do is open a screen. The first thing they do is look at the assignment on a phone. They open a Chromebook. They open a Surface. They open a screen. That's showing children, that we need that the first thing is some kind of stimulation from without, as opposed to a kind of quiet, peaceful, I'm here, and now children, what happened to you since I saw you last? So parents and teachers are often not modeling the most important relational qualities that really children need to be on their best footing for life.
And I feel like this maybe seems a little bit more easy with younger children. I know in the audience, there's many of us who may have teenagers, be educators or parents or aunts and uncles to older kids. What's kind of your advice for what we can do? I'm hearing some things about our own modeling, so maybe when we first see them, making sure we're not looking at our phones. But what are some other concrete things we can do, especially if we are kind of caught up? And I'm thinking about one of the questions that was raised earlier too, of a 15-year-old where, on their device all the time, not wanting to deal with boredom. What is that? What are your recommendations?
I actually think that parents and teachers are not stepping up to our responsibility. Because we actually know a lot, and more every month, about the harms that the amount of time teenagers are spending on their phone are doing to them. And not harm from the content. I think we have to separate out, are they watching bad things? This notion of doom scrolling. With the news as it is, if you're watching, if you're reading about the news, you're doom scrolling. It's doom. But Independent of the content, watching screens that much and not being attentive to the give and take of conversation with other people begins to be kind of an assault on empathy, because you're not practicing. Now, the question is, what skills are you practicing with your family, and what skills are you saying it's important to cultivate? Conversation and learning how to have an empathic conversation is not like people just are good at it because we're human beings. I mean, we're wired for it because, I'm not there with you, so I can't see your face, so I can't do the thing. But we're wired so that if we were together, I could pick up on the tiniest movement of your facial musculature, and I would feel it in my face. We have mirror neurons where I would feel the way your face is responding to me, and I would have, a physical experience of what a conversation with you is about. That is what we are wired to do. That is what we are good at. And if you're not showing your teenager how much you value that, how important that sensitivity and that empathic connection is to you as a parent, you're not, I don't think you're doing them, or a teacher, you're not doing them justice. So I begin there's a lot of talk about what to do in classrooms. I start my classroom by saying, look, this is a chance to talk to me and talk to each other for 2 hours, a couple of times a week. The content you're going to get from people say, oh, there's so much content on my phone, I can learn so much. The content on your phone will always be there, but the chance to talk to this extraordinary group of people and really understand them in depth, that's very special for the next 2 hours. So no phones, no electronics, because we really need to experience each other. And I talk to them about why. I don't just say no phones, it's a rule. We read about mirror neurons, we read about conversation, we talk about why it's good to have a conversation with peers and a professor who really cares about them. And for 2 hours, they put away their phones. It doesn't I feel as though I'm doing my job and showing them my values and giving them the best of me. I don't feel it's punitive, and I feel it's an education in what is special about being with a human teacher. Plenty of opportunities to see me talk online and not be able to do that with me. So I probably take a harder line about the importance of being able to have conversations, because if you look at what's happening in this country, the capacity to empathize and to have conversations with people we don't agree with people where we really have to stretch our imaginations and our sensitivity, has never been more important. So I think we're giving up the store if we don't really say, for example, in the car is a place where this family talks to each other. It is not a place where we do social media. And teenagers will go, blah, 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 it's terrible, terrible. I'm driving, I'm not doing my social media. Talk to me in the car. And I think teenagers will respect ultimately when you explain why. I think parents have wanted to do their social media at dinner, so they've let things pass that are not good. And I think in the classrooms I go into, there's much too much emphasis on things that you can do on screens.
I'm thinking now, I'm shifting a little bit, thinking about the pandemic. And I think there's shared agreement generally that the pandemic was particularly challenging for adolescents. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on FaceTime or video chatting. And can that help us recapture conversation? Again, we're not in person, but you're able to see some of those visual cues and have those conversations, particularly, during the pandemic when it was so challenging and we couldn't be in person.
Well, of course. I mean, the Zoom saved our lives, saved our sanity. I mean, the point is not to be grateful for how technology came in and made it possible to see your relatives, to see your friends, to not go crazy, to have seders, I'm not a Luddite. I mean, my house is the graveyard of every computer from the beginning. I mean, I'm a tremendous user and lover of technology. But I've always said that technology has a way, it's a kind of law of technology. It goes from saying, wow, this is better than nothing, to this is better. And that's the danger with Zoom. In other words, oh, Zoom, it was better than nothing during the pandemic, to, well, maybe it's better. It's just better. Maybe we can have more of this Zoom stuff. How many more, let's just think about how many meetings we can have on Zoom and how many times we don't have to meet in person and how much more we can do not face-to-face. And that goes for psychotherapy, the way in which the profession of psychotherapy, which I follow very closely, is really had brilliant and well worked out arguments that were deeply theoretically grounded for why face-to-face therapy, let's call it in the room therapy, was very important to the therapeutic process, to now really people just saying, oh, well, it's kind of the same, let's just do therapy virtually. The medical profession, where doctors, and I'm not saying there's not room for telemedicine, because of course there is, but doctors who really believed how important it was to touch a patient, to feel the skin, to look into, to be with the patient, that was part of their job. Telemedicine for everything. So therapy, telemedicine, teaching, online education. As I say, there's a place for all of these things, but there's also the necessity for our saying critically, am I just doing this thing that technology does, where it goes from being better than nothing to just being better? And the first time I saw this, and the first time it hit me, was when I was doing a study of pet robot dogs. And I gave out all of these pet robot dogs to older people and interviewed their grandchildren about, I interviewed their whole families, but one of the cohorts that I interviewed was their grandchildren, about the relationships of the older people to the pet robot dogs. And one little boy said first, well, my grandmother has the IBO and it's better than nothing because she's allergic to dogs. So I'm glad you were able to give her an IBO. And 6 months later, he said, I think the IBO is better than any dog could ever be because it will never die. And my grandfather died, and this way she'll never have to experience the sadness of losing the dog. And that was a profound moment for me, because here was this little boy who had come to see something that could not love his grandmother. I mean, could not cuddle, didn't even know the grandmother was there or not there. I mean, it was a hunk of machinery, as not just better than nothing, but really better, because although it had no attachment, she would never have to lose it. And I found that a very profound moment in making this larger point for me about technology and its discontents.
Well, and it's really the example you're highlighting. It's allowing us to avoid negative feelings and emotions and even experiences.
Yes. And I just went to a conference where the subject was chatbot psychotherapy. And they weren't joking. I mean, it wasn't like an advertising thing. I mean, they really are, there really are chatbots that can convince you you're talking to a real person. And the question they're being promoted as really alternatives to seeing a human therapist. And when you talk to people who use them and who say they get something out of it, it often has to do with the lack of vulnerability they feel in talking to a robot instead of a person. And if you try to introduce into the conversation, but it doesn't understand anything about your humanity. I mean, it can fool you. I mean, it's very smart, quote unquote. It can make conversation, but it doesn't know what it is to be afraid or to die, or it doesn't have the arc of a human life. People say, well, but I don't have to really reveal myself, and isn't it very often that therapists are predators or don't really care anyway, or that it's a way that I think technology in many cases is a way for us not to be vulnerable to each other. And I think that there's so many young people today who have their Oculus headsets ready and are dreaming of the metaverse, and they're going to have this metaverse sold to them by companies who are just waiting to get them into the metaverse. And it feels to me that with the problems we have on Earth, sustaining our democracy, taking care of our fragile planet, trying to commit to that, trying to commit to talking to each other and respecting each other, respecting each other's bodies, respecting each other's health. Like the metaverse, with all of its technical excitement, is like the last, it's like the break the glass moment. It really is the last thing we need now to escape to. And yet, that's what's hot. So I have, I'm very concerned about taking the what's hot in technology and letting that be our lodestar for thinking about our futures. I think parents and educators who are thinking about learning, relationships, morality, family life, democracy, the community values for their children under their care are much more in touch with what children need.
I want to stick with what you said about democracy for a moment. In your book, Reclaiming Conversation, you end one of your chapters with two questions. You say, she sees me here. What is intimacy without privacy? And then what is democracy without privacy? Can you help us understand why privacy is important for democracy and how we can explain this to our kids who might have different understandings around the importance of privacy?
Yes, I have a great example, actually. I was interviewing a young woman about Facebook and, how expressing herself on Facebook. And she said to me, well, I know that Facebook takes my data. So I really don't like to talk much on Facebook because it's not safe. And she said, but fortunately, in other words, she's saying she has no privacy. And then she says, but fortunately, I don't really have any controversial ideas. So that's lucky, because if I had any controversial ideas, I would have no place really to express them. So I said, oh, no controversy. I'm a good interviewer. So I didn't go, what? I said, oh, no controversial ideas. So we talked a little more. She had lots of controversial ideas. She had lots of controversial ideas about everything, about every aspect of politics, reproductive rights. The woman was filled with controversial ideas. So what's happening there? The fact that she doesn't feel that she has a place to express her ideas, the fact that she feels she has no privacy, means that she's learning the habits, not of living in a democracy where you feel free to express yourself, but of living in an authoritarian society where you know to keep your ideas to yourself because it's not safe to say them out loud. So Michel Foucault is a great social theorist who wrote about this kind of thing, about the relationship between media, really, and our inner lives and our inner sense of empowerment. So here's this beautiful woman, this talented, brilliant young woman who is learning how to self-center and not learning the habits that will let a democracy thrive, because she knows that her medium of expression is not safe. So I hope that gives a kind of concrete, and that was not an isolated case. I think that's a generational case of how the way in which we have allowed social media to become an out of control I don't know what to call it. It's kind of an out of control part of our culture has suppressed some of the democratic habits that we really need to have thrive. You can't have a citizenry that's afraid to speak up. You can't have children who are afraid to speak up. And that's the kind of thing that it becomes too late in a certain sense if you say to a school, okay, now we're just going to have days of reflection, because you're dealing with children who, in a very profound way, are afraid to talk because they know their thoughts, are not safe.
So what can we do about that as individuals, as concerned citizens, thinking about the responsibilities of tech companies, of government? I know I'm throwing a lot at you at once, but kind of breaking it down into the different constituent groups. What are some things that we can do or should be doing?
Well, a lot. First of all, I'm going to just get into my chair, sit up, get into my power pose, get into that kind of activist. First of all, as parents, I love the question from the parent. I don't know his name, but I love the question from the parent who said, okay, so what are you going to do in school to get my child, with some right thinking? Here's what I'm doing at home. I want to hear about what we're going to do in school. I want some allies. I think we have to begin to behave as consumers before we had seatbelts in our cars. Before we had rules of the road that said, do not drive over 60 miles an hour, where I'm living now, do not drive over 45 miles an hour. Before we had, remember when the seat backs, I'm old enough to know when the seat backs just kind of came to your shoulders. They didn't go up to your head. There were no headrests. It was that old headrest that ruins the lines of the car. we have to say, we're driving a car that is designed for a wreck. It's designed to go up in flames and to create the maximum possible human carnage if you get into an accident. And we're driving this technology without any rules of the road. And we have to behave like empowered consumers. We are the ones who are buying this stuff. And we are not behaving as though we have any power at all. So I think the first thing, I mention this as the first thing, because I don't think in the interviews that I do with parents and with teachers and with school principals, and the tech companies have taken a kind of role where they are giving us, what they choose to give us, the platforms they choose to give us. Apple tells us what our new, its new operating system. It announces it. It has a big fair. No, we are the consumers. And I think we have to start to behave as though there are certain things that finally, after 30 years of this, and a lot of knowledge about what works and doesn't work for people, a lot of studies about what works and doesn't work for people, we behave like empowered consumers, and we are not. This has barely started to happen. I don't want to say it hasn't happened at all, but it has barely started to happen. So within the home, just really locally within the home, I talk about, in Reclaiming Conversation, I talk about sacred spaces. That in your home, there should be some place, and not everybody has a big home, they can't, say it's a room, but there should be a place where you can go and there just aren't phones there. Because it's important to have a place where people can have conversations and nobody's taking out their phone. Because that's a very different kind of conversation than when people are taking out their phones. And I don't want to get into it here now about what happens, there's a lot of research about what happens in conversations when you take out your phone, but basically it lowers the amount of empathy in that conversation. It's extraordinary. Even the presence of a phone face down, turned off, lowers the amount of empathy that's shown in the conversation. Why? Even if the phone is turned off, because it reminds you of all the other places you can be. So the phone can be toxic to a relationship, even if it's kind of turned off. So places in the home, and then places during the day in the life of a family, where the family, and of course this is the parents who start from when the children are 0, just say, this is not a place where we have phones. And I suggest that it be anything having to do with food preparation, dinner, breakfast, anything having to do with food and meals, including food preparation, that is a place where you can say, this is just for conversation. And I also add the car, because I think that the driver isn't driving, so that's one person not on their phone. And the car is the hidden, it's the hidden weapon for parents getting to know and understanding what's happening in the lives of their children. So at a very local level, in the life of the family, I think parents should step up with sacred spaces, sacred places, sacred activities that they assert really from the child's youngest ages. And as consumers, I think you want really their activist model of how did consumers organize to get seatbelts in cars? Because really the way networks are set up now, we know a lot about how Facebook works, for example, is that the platform is designed for maximum engagement, which is usually by making you angry, and then by keeping you walled off with other people who were just like you and angry just like you. So it gets you mad, and then it keeps you with people who are mad in the same way that you're mad. This isn't teaching empathy. This isn't, this is keeping us in the angry tribal groups. And it's teaching habits of conversation, of how you talk to other angry tribal people. That is exactly what this country doesn't need now. I mean, just to talk locally about our country. People should be fighting this. This really is not, instead of worrying about, what kind of pornographic content here and there, this is a much more fundamental problem that we have with these platforms. It's teaching us habits of thought that are the worst possible habits of thought. And we should be organizing to get this to change. So I think, I don't want to go on with too much specifics, so I lose you all in my 10-point program. But I think I guess I'm trying to paint a picture of an engaged consumer population that really takes seriously that this technology is that we are at the tipping point, and we're at the break the glass moment with this technology, because a generation has grown up thinking this is natural. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, did you like the play?
I'm stuck on the kind of the habits too, and I think it just kind of underscores the importance of, we talk at Common Sense about developing skills and dispositions, habits of mind, of reflecting, slowing down, thinking about other perspectives, considering multiple outcomes, and then doing exercises to practice that. So we're building kind of that muscle memory. And so when, kids are in front of their screens at 10 o'clock at night making a decision about what to do, they can kind of stop and reflect and think about it because they've practiced. And I'm also thinking about what you're saying with being consumers, that it also means, with the car analogy, we have our kids in the car, we're still driving with them. And so I think also it's helpful to engage in activities with our kids, to do the things that they're doing and know more about what they're excited about. I'm just struck by a recent story where a parent was sharing, walking into the living room where her two teens and a friend were all watching YouTube videos. I won't talk about, they were like exploring QAnon conspiracies. It wasn't high quality, but they were watching it, but then they were all engaging in conversation about it. And when they stopped watching it, the conversation continued. And so they were having that real connection as well.
Yes.
So I'm thinking about that as also the launching point, because as we're having these conversations with our kids, I just want to be mindful of conflict. These are really existential issues, and we also want to build a place where our kids know that they can come and talk to us.
I'm glad you bring that up, because I'm not, when I say, in the car.
Or walking for us New Yorkers.
For example, I believe that when your child goes on Facebook, you should go on Facebook with your child, and you should be the one who talks to them about what's on it, introduce them, and you should always be there to, as a kind of dialogue partner, to talk about what they're doing online. I mean, that's kind of like what I do for a living, is to talk to kids about what they're doing online and what they, so I definitely don't want to be misunderstood as saying, no, don't go tell your children they shouldn't be online. It's bad to be online. No, not at all. Every generation has to experience the technology of their generation. That would be like telling, my parents telling me, no rock and roll, no LP records. That's, that, all I would do is, listen to them under the bed. That's not what you want to do at all. But I'm saying that parents can model that this technology causes you to, if you use it all the time in every circumstance, you can lose the possibility for conversations that you need to have in addition that the kind of conversation that you have when you're looking up and down. I interviewed a lot of kids who talked to me about the rule of three, which is that when they were in a group, 3 people had to have their head up, and then they felt free to look down at their phone, because the conversation could continue if 3 people had their head up. And that was kind of like when they really were saying this with great respect for me and for my belief in conversation. But then we talked about, and for their belief in conversation, they didn't want conversations to stop. But then we talked about, well, what kind of conversation would you want to have when people were going like this, looking at their phone and then looking up and then checking if there were 3 people looking and then going back down. And it wasn't a conversation, for example, about a death in the family, or really a conflict you were having with your mother, or an important decision, or, there you needed all eyes up. So as I stayed in these groups and listened to these conversations, people were keeping them light in order to obey the rule of 3. And the more we talked about that, the more these teenagers came to think, it would be good to have some conversations where we just put our phones away, and then maybe we could talk about these other things. So I think it's a kind of consciousness raising where nothing is being taken away, but people respect the power of this technology to change the kinds of conversations we can have. Maybe that's a better way to put my position on this.
Yeah. And that we should not relinquish our power too. I'd like to open up to questions from the audience. Oh yeah.
All right. Hi, my name's Jules. I kind of have a long-winded question, so bear with me. So you kind of talked to too many screens in the classroom, and Mark Zuckerberg's latest Meta ad was focused on education and development. To me, that's like unarguably the only, net positive situation of things like virtual reality. And in that, of course, VR is grounded in that. VR came about because of training astronauts in order to go to the moon. So they had that goal of going to the moon. But today, things like virtual reality are just going to be keeping people in place, especially when it comes to social tech. But it goes back to the previous speaker's point of VR, you're going to be able to immerse yourself in these realities, and within education or whatever, when you're talking about the 1800s or whatever it is, that's attractive, right? And in commercials, it's attractive. But VR being used heavily in schools and work feels like indoctrination to me almost, because you don't have any other option but to participate in it then. And it kind of goes into, I was here the opening ceremony night, and John made a good point of, if you cross a certain line, you're in it. It's almost like you're in it for good. It's hard to step back. So these big decisions for how you're going to lead your life, whether it's immersed in this next level of technology or not. I recently read a book. It was Google CEO, previous Eric Schmidt. It's called The Age of AI, and he talked about the emergence of physicalist and virtualist. How do you look at this next level decision? Because it's coming much sooner than we think. If you want to lead your life with that, and if it's utilized in education and work more so, things like virtual reality, how do you look at that next level decision of things?
Thank you for that wonderful question. Eric Schmidt once said, if you're worried about privacy, don't be a Luddite. Just be good. And that's how he justified the policy of scraping data. Essentially the epistemic basis of how social media turned to its money-making business model of making us the
The product.
Product. Yeah, usually people say the product, but making us but it's not exactly that we're the product, we're the raw materials, of its mining in order to sell us in bits and pieces to make money. If you don't like that, don't be a Luddite, just be good. And I guess by telling the story of Lana, I was trying to make the point that people need a place when they're in a democracy to develop the habits of thought that democracy needs, where they're not good, where they can be subversive, where they can have crazy ideas, where they can just talk, where they're not being surveyed and where they're experimenting with ideas, and that is a little bit how I feel about the metaverse. That, to me, this is what I keep saying, the break the glass moment. That not only it is putting your life into a surveillance medium, it is saying to the world of troubles that we have created, I have an alternative. I don't have to look at the homeless people. I don't have to look at the crisis in infrastructure. I don't have to look at what's falling down in my city. I'm in a Paris cafe, but you're not. You're not. And I think it is for it to come up now. I mean, it reminds me of the billionaires saying, "Well, this is the perfect moment to go to space." Really? Is this the perfect moment to go to space? With our medical system the way it is, with the number of people who were uninsured and who were dying, the amount of poverty, the amount of child poverty, the amount of food insecurity, is this the perfect moment to go to space? I mean, there's some kind of disconnect between the fragile planet and let's go to space, let's go to virtual reality, let's give up all our data, let's live in this alternate world, that for me is not the direction that I wish digital culture was going. So I share your concerns, and I treat this like a consumer. I don't want this, I will do everything to write and to argue that it's not the direction schools should go. I think it's going to collect data on kids that we don't want collected. It's going to collect data on teachers we don't want collected, on citizens. I think it's just a bad idea. And of course, there are wonderful applications. I mean, again, there are wonderful applications. So let's develop those. Let's identify the wonderful applications and let's pursue those. But that doesn't mean, but it's not being sold as there are wonderful applications, let's pursue those. It's being sold as a new way of life. But you're going to see Apple and Google and Microsoft, and you're starting to see it, give out virtual reality materials and augmented reality materials to schools, just the way they gave out a zillion Chromebooks. Every school got a Chromebook for you, Chromebook. I mean, I remember being in a school. They said Chromebook for you, Chromebook for you. You put the whole library on a Chromebook, and libraries and schools closed because of that. And now it's like headphones for you, headphones for you. It's like Oprah. And I think we really have to watch that.
Was there a question in the back?
When you speak about the car that we're driving, which is built for a wreck, and if that car is the existential car that's about to crash, do you find any other solution to this problem Or do you find any solution to this problem that is other than facing, without flinching, our pain? And what I mean by pain, I mean from the spectrum of deep feelings of meaninglessness, pointlessness, despair, and loneliness, to the experience of the discomfort in just boredom.
I think boredom is, we need to reinvent boredom as the good thing that it is. Boredom has been sold to us as a state of pain from which technology can save us. Boredom is not a state of pain from which technology needs to come in like Wonder Woman and save us. Boredom is, when you're bored, your brain is not bored. Your brain is actually knitting together what's called the default mode network, which is the parts of your brain that set up your sense of a stable autobiographical self. It can only do that when you're not being stimulated, when you're not online, when you're not doing all this other stuff. So you need those moments of just zoning out where you're in the taxi cab or just kind of staring at the ocean, or you need those moments of boredom for the brain to do this important work. We have to get back to a toleration of boredom because the human brain and the human psyche needs that. We are human beings. We have gotten used to being sort of cyborg, like the flesh attachments to these machines, and we can be constantly stimulated. We're paying a price for that constant stimulation. So I'm saying I want to reframe this problem so that you would ask your question in a different way. That, well, you know, we've spent 20, 25 years living with this technology. It's been an interesting ride. I was there at the beginning of it. I had highs and lows with it, but I think I've been able to step back and see it's had a lot of lows. And now it's time to, the French expression is, faire le bilan, do the accounting sheet and see that we need to value boredom again. We need to value solitude again. We need to revalue empathy when this thing is an empathy killer. We need to get back to conversation, and this thing is really, it's not so good for conversation because we're so looking up and looking down from it. And we need to really look carefully at this metaverse thing and figure out whose interest it's really in before we just sell it to our kids. So I don't think this is going to be pain as much as really being willing to accept that we're human, accept again that we're human. Maybe we've gotten away from that. Maybe that is painful. Maybe you're right. Maybe that is painful.
I think that also highlights what you wrote in your book. You said just because technology can solve a quote problem doesn't mean it was actually a problem to begin with.
Yes. So what is the problem that the metaverse is solving? So I know that the problem that your phone is solving or texting is solving is that people really feel less vulnerable. I mean, it's doing a lot of things. It's doing a lot of very, communication things. But it's solving a problem that people feel much less vulnerable when they send a text instead of having a conversation. Human vulnerability is really uncomfortable. And if you text and don't talk, you feel less vulnerable. You can just always say, oh, I didn't get it, or you just close it, or you disappear, you ghost somebody. You are less vulnerable. And what is the problem that the metaverse is solving that we need it so badly? Because I would argue that after the pandemic, what we need badly is new ways of talking to each other, getting back with each other, building our communities again. I don't, and our local communities that are going to solve our problems with water and air and housing and healthcare locally. We're dying. Taking care of each other, getting each other to vote, making peace across tremendous differences, not getting me in touch with somebody who lives halfway around the world so I can pretend something with them. That is not my biggest problem. That is not, in our country, that is not our biggest problem now, is pen pals. I feel very strongly about this, that what our democracy needs now is not like pen pals. We need to get together with the people in our community, and we should use the power of the internet to help us get together with the people in our community. That would be, I think, the most important projects to use the internet for. And there I would be far from a Luddite. I would be in the forefront of working on those projects.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turkle. It has been such a pleasure hearing your thoughts and reflections, and I myself was taking a ton of notes. So thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight as well. And I know I'm leaving with thinking about more opportunities for in-person, meaningful connections, solitude, thinking about ways to be vulnerable and not shy away from it. And I think ultimately to remembering that we do have the power and we really need to fight for what's important to us from kind of a big picture, humanistic, democratic perspective. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. This has really been so wonderful. Thank you for inviting me.